So where we left off was I'd really showed you how to apply the multi-resolution modifier, right? Remember, it's important that before you do this sculpting, although you can sculpt to practice with and play with it, right? If you haven't done your UV and wrapping, but you want to explore this, technically you don't have to have the UVs for the sculpting, but when we bake out a normal map for this, we need the UVs for the normal map to bake properly and line up on the mesh. So generally you want your UVs done on this before you do the sculpting, but if you just want to practice the sculpting, play with it, get the mechanics of it down, remember you can always delete the multi-resolution and then UV and wrap your model, right? So it's pretty straightforward to be able to kind of play with that if you need to. The sculpting itself doesn't need the UVs, just the actual baking process for the normal map does later on, or displace map, whatever your kind of target is. So if you want to, you can, just to play with sculpting, apply a multi-resolution modifier, right there. Subdivide it, right? Remember, it gives you 0 at the initially, so you have to subdivide a couple times to get a couple of levels of resolution, basically more polygons. And of course, 5 is Sculpt Mode, right? Remember, the Sculpt Mode is right here. It's part of our modes menu, Sculpt Mode. Industry compatible, default quick is 5, right? And of course, we're in the sculpting workspace, which kind of turns on by default your default matte cap, and it turns Sculpt Mode on, right? So when you actually go to sculpting workspace, Sculpt Mode will get turned on. So remember, you can play with this without having the UVs. You can always delete the modifier later on, right? So you can always click on that X, get rid of it, and it gets rid of the sculpting you did. So if you're still UV and wrapping, but you want to play with the sculpting just to kind of play with and experiment with the lectures that we're doing, feel free to, right? You can always get rid of it. Okay, so at this point, what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you a little bit more, because, right, we saw a bit about our stroke stuff, like line stroke, which is what we finished up yesterday, drag dot. So there are some neat strokes in here for your different tools, right? I'll set that back to space, because I like the tools to have their default space on. Space is the default. That's basically where it just lets you do regular sculpting, right? It doesn't apply any unique feature to the stroke, like be able to drag dots for rivets or do straight lines. So stroke space is kind of your default, right? Basically limit brush application distance specified by spacing, right? So it just lets you sculpt, right? So space is a good default for a lot of your sculpting, but there are some other great strokes in there. And that's really another thing I want to take a look at, is I want to look at some more strokes today. But I also wanted to show you masking, because in particular, if you combine masking or with a curve stroke or just regular masking, you do some cool little paneling effects, right? And that's what I wanted to spend 10 minutes showing you guys. So, of course, also remember that sculpting can't have a mirror modifier on. So to get symmetry for sculpting, you have to actually go up to here, right? And you see where my cursor's at? There's like a little butterfly cut in half kind of icon. And you see XYZ. So this actually gives you symmetry for your sculpting, right? Or painting, for that matter of fact. All right. And we're going to do some more sculpting on this next week, right? I want to do some more parts here. But I figured we'd do a little bit of introducing you to masking and paneling, and we'll do some more of that stuff next week. So basically, everything you need to know, you're going to see in these first 2 videos, and then I'm going to do another video or two and another lecture or two where I do more of the same. And it just gives you a great way to kind of see it a couple times, have a couple of videos going over the same stuff. All right. So masking. Where is the masking tool? Well, if you're in the sculpting workspace and you have Sculpt Mode on, right? Remember, Sculpt Mode quick key is 5, right? 5. You'll see that there is a list of tools on the side here, right? A lot of your major sculpting tools like Draw Sharp, where's pinch at? Crease is right there. Smooth is right here. Flatten's actually there. You can do some other things like pinch, which can be cool. Grab, right? There's some cool sculpting tools here. But you'll notice there's a little scroll bar here on the side, right? And you can actually use your scroll wheel for this too, right? Your scroll wheel, we don't usually want to use it that much in Blender. Like if you're going to use navigation for zoom, right? Alt-right mouse button instead of scroll wheels. Scroll wheel is a little jumpy for zoom. Alt-right mouse button smoother. But when you need to scroll up and down areas that have scrollability, your scroll wheel on your mouse can work. Right? So I can scroll down here And you see towards the bottom, we start to get to tools that we can use for masking, right? There is a box mask right here. There is a lasso and a line mask feature. We have line project that can do some neat stuff. But up here, kind of a little bit below what looks like cloth, like a purple cloth, there's one that's basically, it looks like a ball with a brush, but it's kind of got some white and gray, right? So it's kind of right when you start getting past these yellow ones, you'll start to see one that says just mask, right? You'll see it's kind of above like an eraser one, right? It's multi-resolution displacement eraser. So it's right here. It's called mask. It's a couple up from the box mask one, and it's kind of just a little bit below the purple cloth one and the yellow brushes. But you see how scroll wheel can get you, if you put your cursor over these sculpting tools, if you just scroll down on your scroll wheel, you'll get more brushes. And there is one called masking, right? Mask, right here. There's actually several mask tools. They're actually pretty good. Blender's got some pretty good masking tools. But in this case, we're just going to use the regular paint mask. So by default, regular paint mask can just do this. And what we'll do is we'll turn strength up to 100, right? So strength was at 0.5. Strength is the amount, right? So 0.5, it's doing 50% of a mask. At strength of 1, it's doing 100% of a mask, right? So keep that in mind for strength for sculpting, right? Is the lower the strength number, the less of it something it'll do. The higher the number, the more it'll do, with 1 kind of being the max, particularly for masking. And you'll notice that I could just left-click drag to paint this kind of dark gray. And you'll notice that I can go in here and I could basically just paint a panel in here if I wanted to. So I could easily just left-click drag, just paint this. So masking can be used for just regular painting, right? You just left-click drag to paint this. If you hold down Control, you see how you can paint the mask out. If I remember, negative will paint the mask out. So see how I can come in here and I can just turn the negative on right here to mask, or to not mask, to unpaint the mask. But by default, Control inverses, right? So if you hold down Control and left mouse click, you'll notice that you can basically go in here and inverse from painting the mask to not painting the mask. But that's really what plus and minus do. Control just inverses your brush. So whatever you have on by default, Control inverse it, right? So if I have negative on to unpaint, then Control paints, right? So it's more correct to think of Control as inversing your brush, flipping its function. Whereas plus and minus are kind of the more default sculpt out, sculpt in, paint mask, don't paint mask. But there are buttons right there for it. And so you see how you can actually go in here and just paint some masks. Now, masking can use all of your stroke types. So if I go to stroke right here, stroke method line, you'll notice that I could paint mask lines, right? So this might make it a little easier for you to get kind of a cleaner effect there. And I'll turn it back to space just to kind of fill it in here a bit. So all of your functions work with your masking, right? You can actually use all your texture stuff, you can use all your stroke stuff, but you can basically paint a mask. And you see how you can kind of go in here and paint panel shapes with this. Now, right now, it's not really a panel though, right? It's really just a mask. What a mask does is it sets it up so that the area that's masked cannot be affected. So if I go back to, like, say, my regular sculpt brush here, you see when I sculpt, it sculpts outside of the mask, but not on the mask. So masking basically says you can't do anything here. It's kind of locked that from being sculpted. What's really cool, though, is you can invert a mask. Right? See, there's a mask menu up here for in your sculpt mode. There's a menu called mask. Fill mask doesn't quite do what you think it does. It kind of fills it for the whole object, if you will. And there's some other things here, shrink and grow and shrink masks. Those don't work ideally as like I'd like them to, but there is clear mask, so you can get rid of one, Control A, and there is invert mask, Control I. And what's cool about inverting the mask is now I can sculpt to pull that out, right? So by inverting the mask, we've made it so that kind of the areas that I painted to be the panel, I can now do panel stuff too, right? So sometimes it's easier to paint the mask because you don't really want that much mask off, and then inverse it. But the mask itself, that dark gray area, you can't sculpt on, right? It's kind of locking it down. It's masking it so you can't do anything to it. It's often easier to paint the mask and then invert it than it is to unpaint the mask, right? So I did invert. Now you notice though when I sculpt this out, it's not making it terribly even, right? That's where this other cool brush over here comes in handy. So if I go back over, put my cursor over the sculpt tools, and I scroll down with the scroll wheel, you'll see way down here, and it's actually towards the bottom, past the masking tools, there's one that looks like kind of a ball with a square and like some blue squiggly lines coming out of it. That's called mesh filter. See that one right there? It's kind of right below that line project that looks like a sphere being cut in half by a line. But it's a gray ball with kind of a box and a blue shape with squiggles on the ends. That's called mesh filter. When I click on that, you'll notice it's got strength 1, it's got an orientation, it's doing it along all 3 axes. And by default, it's set to inflate. Although, if you click on inflate, you could smooth, you could scale, you could randomize it, you can enhance or sharpen details, you can erase displacement in that area. I usually primarily just use it for inflate, but you do have some other options. But the default is inflate, because honestly, you're probably going to use it the most for that, even though you have other cool features for it. But it is mesh filter. And what's cool is if I left-click drag in the viewport, you see what it does? It basically pushes the non-masked area in or out, if I just drag left or right, from the surface along your X, Y, and Z. You can kind of basically think about it like pushing along normal direction, but on a sculpted mesh. And you see how you can make paneling that way? That's really, really cool, right? That's really neat that you can actually make paneling for your ship that way. Simply just by painting a mask, inversing the mask, and then you could use something like mesh filter inflate to do that. Now in this case though, I wanted to go about a slightly different masking feature, but that is there. We'll come back and I'll kind of do some actual paneling like that on other parts of the ship. Today's really about kind of showing you masking and integrating it. So I'm going to go back to my paint mask, right, which is that one up here. Nice thing, you can always watch the videos to see which brush it is. But it's called mask, so if you just hover your cursor over it, it'll say mask. I'm going to go back to stroke, and I'm going to pick a different stroke method. So I'm going to switch on space, click on it, and there's a lot of options in here. We've seen drag dot, space is the default line. There's one below line, though, called curve. Now, do you have to use curve for the masking for this? No, but I want to make sure you guys see that it's pretty cool and it can do some neat stuff. I would like to see some masking for some paneling on this, but if you want to kind of do it like the other way I showed you, that's fine too. Curve is a smidge tricky to work with. It's quite powerful, quite cool, pretty straightforward to use, but it's a little tricky. So I'm going to switch to curve stroke method, and I'm going to click draw curve. Now with draw curve on, what I could do is I'm going to hold down control, and I'm going to left-click drag. So I'm going to control left-click drag. And you see what it does is it creates a triangle. And as you drag, so I'm holding down control and left mouse dragging. It's not control left-click, it's control left mouse drag. And you see how it actually pulls out this kind of Bezier handle. Now if I control left-click again on another part, see how it makes another point with Bezier handles? And then I can control left-click here, maybe one more control left-click there. So by control left-clicking, you create a point, and you create these handles that you can adjust later on to play with the curve shape. Now this is going to be based on the view, so you have to be aware of that. You see how these handles give you some neat controls for this shape. And you can actually move the points around. So if you want to adjust the points, you would left-click drag on them to move them around a little bit. You can grab these little green squares to kind of adjust the curvature shape. You can even select on a point and hit delete, and it gets rid of that point. So some neat stuff you can actually do with this. It's actually really quite powerful, quite neat. So it is the curve stroke. You do have to control left click when you make points to kind of create the point and let you pull these handles out a bit. And then you can always go back and adjust those points and the handles later on. Now what's really cool is this is on the mask. So if I hit enter, it actually paints the mask based on that curve. Now that's a bit wide, so I'm going to hit Control C for undo. I want to make my brush radius smaller, so let's turn that to, like, say, 15 or 10. Now if I hit enter, it's a much smaller mask curve. And what's really cool is I can keep this curve available, go to a different view, like say the side here, and I can start to move these points around to say like here, move these handles, right? So you see I can move the points later on. So you don't even have to get rid of the curve you've created. You can just modify it to do some new shaping. And I can have this line up with right about there. Grab those handles. I'm actually going to get rid of one of these. Delete a point. There we go. So remember, you can select on the points to move them, the triangles. You can grab these handles to kind of control the tangency of the curve, right? The direction. And then I can hit enter and it makes another little curve right there. But you see how we're kind of doing some really neat, really precise, clean masking with that same thickness there? Now, if need be, of course, I can always delete that curve to get rid of it. There's no more curve there anymore. And if I want, I could always do a new curve. Stroke, draw curve. And remember, it's Control left click drag to create the point and drag the curves out for the handles. Control left click drag. Control left click drag. Control left click drag. And of course I can move that point over a little bit. So remember, these handles are always available once you've done it. Right? The triangles themselves, the kind of pinkish triangles, are the points. And when you Control left click drag, it creates the point and lets you drag out these handles that you can use to control, like we said, the actual shape of the curvature. And then of course I can hit enter and it paints that mask there. Really cool. Am I going to show you this stuff more again? Yeah. So I'm going to get rid of that curve. You see how it allowed us to do some precision, really, really neat kind of masking for paneling shapes. And of course I can do mask, invert mask. And I can go back to the mesh filter, right, which is that kind of gray sphere with the box and the blue shape with that squiggly inflates on. So I can just left click drag to kind of inflate inward. And remember, your symmetry is on, so it's masking on both sides. And of course I can clear mask. And you can see I made some kind of neat little paneling there on that ship. So, of course, you can just manually paint a big shape if you want to pull out a plate. But if you're looking to create some really precise, clean grooves, you can actually do that with your masking features. All right, I'm going to save that just so we kind of have a little bit of that in there, right? But remember, you can, of course, go back to your mask tool. And I can always make sure to set my stroke back to space. My brush a little bigger. Like I said, we can combine both of these, right? I can go in here and I can just do a little bit of this. If you want your stroke to be a little cleaner on your mask, you can go to Stroke and turn on Stabilize Stroke. It's a checkbox. And you see what it does is it kind of has this line follow along to kind of keep the stroke a little bit cleaner. And that in itself can actually help to make the stroke smoother, even when you're doing like free painting. And remember, Control left click will inverse, and then I'll turn off Stabilize Stroke because it's a little faster without it on. You see how there's some neat, really, really powerful features in the strokes, not only for sculpting, but for texture painting. And then, of course, I can hit mask, invert mask. And actually, I'm going to maybe paint that in a little bit there. There we go. And then, of course, I can scroll down for my tools, find that mesh filter again. And I can just inflate that out a little bit, right? So you just left-click drag to inflate it out. Remember, invert mask is Control-I, clear mask is Control-A. And now we have some sculpting using masks. And like I said, we're really going to see all of this stuff again. I'm going to probably do 1 or 2 more videos for you guys that basically do all of the same stuff I've done in these first 2 videos and other parts. So there's really only 2 videos worth of lecture for stuff that I'd like you to do on it. But we'll do a couple of those videos just to get you practice, just so I have a little more going on here. Alright, so that'd be a great place to stop for this video.